Redefining poverty, why depth is a necessary measurement.
There are currently varying definitions for poverty across the world, to the extent that poverty experts can't even agree as to what poverty really means. For example, analyst John Iceland believes that poverty refers to income deprivation, while analyst Amartya Sen says that poverty is more so a deprivation of a person's capabilities to succeed. Others have even argued that poverty has to do with a state in which someone is socially excluded from their peers. Nevertheless, experts can't really decide as to what poverty is.
Capabilities is a big part of the poverty definition. Sin and Nussbaum both believe that capability should be a central part of poverty discussions. However, we believe this is difficult to measure. While money is not necessarily what's important, someone's capabilities is what we really want to know so we know that they can live a good and meaningful life.
So, we are going to define poverty as a person's limited capabilities due to that person's low income. This is what we believe poverty is. Additionally, we believe that this is a complex relationship between income and capabilities, and it sets up a cycle in which each factor often depends on the other. Poverty is often quoted as having a cyclical nature, and cycles are often hard to break.
We like to think of poverty as these two circles, where one circle is low income and another one is limited capabilities. And we believe poverty exists in the overlapping space between these two circles where someone has limited capabilities, but their limited capabilities as a result of their low income. And the size of each circle and the part in between is rather arbitrary, but what we want to focus on is that area in the middle.
In the end of the day, there needs to be a better and more practical way to measure poverty in the US.
The SPM was developed to cover several of the flaws of the OPM, such as geographical differences in family composition, and what is counted as income. The SPM also accounts for necessary health expenses, transportation expenses, and child care expenses. This new measurement allows the government to better gauge poverty in the US and help funnel money where it will be most effective.
As you can see on this map, the OPM and SPM often yield different results. The states in red captured a higher percentage of poverty using the SPM, while the states colored in blue captured a higher percentage using the OPM. In general, the SPM tends to be higher than the OPM in states with higher cost of living because the SPM changes its geographical adjustments. Nevertheless, it's problematic that these measures can produce such differing data. The OPM food basket calculation feels outdated to us. When the first poverty line was developed in the 1960s, the average family spent about one-third of their income on food. The government decided to use this as a minimum food cost so that they could define the poverty line as 3 times the minimum cost of this food basket. Over time, food has gotten cheaper and is now a much smaller share of people's expenses. However, the OPM poverty line is still set at this adjustment. To us, this measurement still feels outdated.
We believe that the FCSU basket that the SPM uses is much more accurate for today's society than the food basket previously used by the OPM. And the FCSU basket includes food, clothing, shelter, and utilities that are necessary for a basic life. And how this works is the government finds the 33rd percentile spending of households in the US on their basket of food, clothing, shelter, and utilities and multiplies that amount by 1.2 to give a little room for extra expenditures, and this is where they set the SPM poverty line.
However, neither of these measurements addresses something that we are going to call the depth of poverty. Though many Americans may fall below the poverty line, we believe that each household may deal with different types or degrees of poverty. For example, in this graph shown above, all the Americans below the red line are considered poor because they fall below this arbitrary poverty line. Yet we would argue that family A, B, and C are living in very different conditions. For example, family C is probably far worse off than family A because of their depth below this red poverty line.
In this hypothetical example with country A and country B, we can see how depth of poverty can affect a country, even if they have the same poverty rate. And you can see in these two graphs that each country has a 50% poverty rate, but the poverty gap is much more severe in country A than country B, which means that there'd be more poorer people in country A than B, as there are more people who are further from the poverty line. And measuring depth of a poverty allows us the potential for this new measurement, which we like to call near poverty. And since poverty is a fluid process and people move from just above and just under the poverty line rather frequently, it's good to know who's at risk for poverty as well. And this gives us the ability to put policy in place ahead of time to help prevent them from falling below the poverty line.
As noted, the poverty line is relatively absolute, which leaves room for many people to fall into what we are going to call near poverty. In this diagram above, though family number 1 is technically above the poverty line, they're likely very similar to family number 2, who falls just below the poverty line. Family 1 is probably still struggling, even though they are not considered impoverished according to the current standards.
Robert Rector believes that our modern society in the United States tends to overmeasure poverty pretty severely. He points out the fact that the poor today live much better than the poor of even 50 years ago, and that how many people, when they hear poverty, their first thought is extreme poverty, such as starvation and chronic homelessness, and that's really not how it is. So he wants a different measure of poverty to better reflect extreme poverty.
Here are some headlines from Robert Rector in the past few years. Rector clearly has a very cynical view of poverty, as he believes that, quote, the war on poverty has been a colossal flop, and that the U.S. is, quote, fighting poverty by promoting poverty. He tries to convince readers that poverty is really not as bad as they may think, because the average impoverished home often has things such as air conditioning, cable TV, or an Xbox.
And these two graphs or charts are one major focal point of Rector's argument. You can see on the left is the amenities owned by all households in the U.S., and on the right is all impoverished households in the U.S. And you can see while poor households do have fewer amenities, most of them still have all the basic functions someone will need, and they still have entertainment options like television, DVD players, and video game systems.
However, we believe that Robert Rector is missing the point. Poverty takes on many different forms and comes with varying consequences. By looking at the depth of poverty, it's really easier to understand how some families are doing better than others. Additionally, besides material wealth, it's important to note that poverty can come with intangibles, such as emotional distress, poor mental and physical health, or social exclusion. These factors extend far beyond any kind of poverty measure.
Depth measurements will also be a useful tool for policymaking. This allows policymakers to be able to target their welfare programs for the groups of people they intend to help, whether that be people far below the poverty line, just under the poverty line, or people at risk for poverty.